Mail, something I look forward to reading each week. And for that reason, I'm all the more pleased that he's taken the time to join us today. But he's here not really because I enjoy reading his column, but because in this 150th year, where there were various attempts to get different levels of celebration and enthusiasm and reflection going on, there were a few people who were really thinking about the future and thinking about it not in terms of incrementalism or managerialism, but in terms of ideas about what kind of country we could be and what kind of ambitious goals we could set for ourselves. And it's for that reason that we wanted Doug to come and talk to this group, which is also not only thinking about what the country has accomplished, but what it can accomplish. That's why we wanted to come and have him join us and give a talk to us today. So we've invited Doug to come and talk about his recent book, Maximum Canada. And if you need some background, Doug is an author. He has a dual citizen, so you cannot be a politician in Australia, but you can do many other things. This is not his only book. He's also written a number of others, including Arrival City, The Final Migration, and Our Next World, and The Myth of the Muslim Tide. And he's had a career that I think many of us sort of romanticize in terms of being responsible for different bureaus, writing around the world. I think you ran the Los Angeles Bureau. You're currently, I think, the international editor of the Globe and Mail. Columnist, yes. So thank you very much for taking the time to join us, and I give you Doug Saunders.
Thank you, Andrew, for that generous introduction, and thank you, everybody, for allowing me to be at this historic gathering. I'd kind of like you to think of me as being the honorary envoy from 1967, gracing your presence, and I mean that literally. I was born a few weeks before the first Confederation of Tomorrow conference. I was one of those centennial babies, and as such, I missed it. I was busy nursing when this genuinely important gathering happened, when a room full of middle-aged white guys in suits really engaged in one of the several but important exercises during that year and that period, where Canadian leadership followed the Canadian people in beginning to recognize the deficits in population, in confederation, in political unity that had been left by the previous century of Canadian development. It was the beginning of that confrontation. So how could I have known that 50 years later, I myself would be a middle-aged white guy in a suit addressing this room? I'm going to talk a little bit about 1967 and how it began a reconciliation and reshaping of Canada. And I'm going to talk a little bit about 1867 and what began then, but what also was postponed, and what left us with a deficit at the end of that first century. And I'm going to talk a little bit about 2017 and where we stand now and where we can grow from there and how to shape a more sustainable future. My starting point is a book I wrote over the last year, built on essays that I'd written over a decade and a half living away from Canada, looking at Canada's history and development through the lens of population, which I think is something that gets neglected. It's something we're not taught, and I'll talk about why a little bit. But it's an important way to understand Confederation, I should say populations. And I think the thing that we were just beginning to confront in 1967, the thing that Canadian leaders were beginning to confront was that we are a country of populations. That we had always been plural, We had always been multilinguistic, multi-ethnic, diverse, but that we had pretended not to be for a very long time. 50 years ago, it was still mainstream thought among much of English Canadian leadership to speak of Canada as one people who were British. We were legally British, all of us, until 1976. And it was a controversial debate occupying much of our time in 1967 over whether we were in fact deux nations. You know, whether, as Diefenbaker said in '67, it would destroy Canadian Confederation to acknowledge that there were two Canadas. Never mind an Indigenous Canada, which had just begun to awaken politically and assert itself and demand the constitutional equality and shared sovereignty that it had been granted under the treaties before. And never mind the fact that most Canadians, certainly most Canadians living in cities by that point, were living a different Canada of many peoples, of many populations. That by 1967, a quarter of Canadians were what the By and By Commission called the third force, people who were not of British or French or Indigenous descent. That was a quarter of us by then. It's almost half of us by now. And again, a big story about Canada is that our institutions and leaders and laws have always lagged behind the understanding of the Canadian people by often a generation. That Canada was already there by 1967. Its leaders and institutions were catching up. So 1967 marked the center of an era during which we started to confront seriously the schisms and divisions and gross inequities that had been hidden beneath a sort of colonial self-mythology of Canada. And we began to recognize the price we'd paid for a century of restricted growth and identity. Over the 50 years that followed, we would have two secession crises, a battle over our North American economic identity, and a hard-fought political reawakening of Indigenous nations. These were the crucial struggles of becoming a real country, of finding a governing mechanism and a common culture to bring together these long disparate peoples. In that light, 1967 can only be seen as the apex of Canada's post-colonial moment. We don't like to talk about it that way. We assume post-colonial crises are things that happen to countries on the southern hemisphere, but really it was. A lot of the wars of that period were over symbols, over flags and anthems and names, but they were a small manifestation of a larger shift in Canadian consciousness. After a century of pretending to be British, Canada finally recognized that it had never been one people with one identity. But in pretending for much of the century to be something other than plural and multiple country, we were left with a deficit. So to understand what was happening in 1967, what we face in 2017, we need to understand what we were missing in 1867. And that's the project I've set out in. And sort of the beginning question of that project was the question of why did we end up with so few people in Canada? Given that our Confederation was meant to be about growth, we launched large-scale immigration campaigns and so on. And of course, we all learned about the ships showing up in Halifax and in Montreal and unloading hundreds of thousands of people. But what we don't learn about is the even larger numbers of people who left Canada during that first century, which most years of the first century of Canada, most decades during the first century of Canada, more people left than arrived. During the period in the 19th century when the largest human migration in history to that point occurred, when 40 million people left Europe for the New World, Canada suffered a net migratory loss. More people left Canada than arrived during that entire period of net movement. Why did we lose these people? And part of the answer is what is best characterized by the modern day phrase, inclusive growth. We like to talk about inclusive growth now. We have a whole federal strategy around inclusive growth. Canada's birth was a project in non-inclusive growth. We wanted growth, we did not want inclusiveness. We wanted to fill the land with people. And we lost out as a consequence of that. Initially, before the 19th century, Canada had been shaping as a place that was connected to a North American economy, that saw Indigenous nations as partners in growth and in nationhood, and that saw itself as a place of communities and local economies and so on. But something happened in the run-up to Confederation, really beginning at the end of the War of 1812, that saw Canada's leaders pursue a pattern of growth designed to fill land with people, not to build cities and communities, but to populate the country for reasons of sovereignty rather than reasons of independence and self-development. From the beginning from a couple decades before Confederation, we started pursuing large-scale immigration drives, first just in Britain, then expanding into Western Europe. In the beginning of the 20th century, briefly, but with great numbers, expanding into populations from Eastern and Southern Europe, who were controversial populations at the time. But the strategy tended to fail, with a few exceptions. The only times when more people stayed in Canada than left, until about the end of the Second World War, were the 1850s, which were the one decade when we had free trade with the United States before the end of the 1980s, and the first decade of the 20th century, the Laurier years, when we saw a substantial number of people come and stay in Canada. But during those periods, during the most famous population growth drives under Macdonald, under Mackenzie King, and so on, we saw, generally speaking, more people leave Canada almost entirely for the United States than arrived in Canada. By the end of the Second World War, Canada, over the 90 years previously, from the 1850s to the 1940s, had attracted only 6.7 million immigrants during a period when the United States had attracted tens of millions, and had seen 6.3 million people emigrate from Canada and leave. So we saw a net population growth through immigration of only 400,000 people, or about 4,000 people per year. And we need to ask, what caused people not to want to stay? What made us a country that drove people away? What made us a country that divided and isolated our communities from each other, that devastated the original communities, and so on? And how do we avoid that in the future? And what lessons can we learn from that? First of all, we had a form of settlement designed, as I said, to fill the land for strategic reasons. The initial settlement of the plains in the late 19th century largely failed. We saw the significant numbers of people moved to Canada and given large tracts of land, but we had not developed cities. We'd not developed economic infrastructure other than the CPR, which was a monopoly and charged a fortune compared to the competing railways to the south. We had closed the southern border to trade, so that it was exorbitantly expensive to start a farm or a business. And we lost people as a result. A fifth of the Quebecois population left for New England. Most of the people who settled in the plains during the 19th century left for the Dakotas, which by the end of the 19th century had a larger population than all of Western Canada. And second of all, we sought farmers rather than people who were going to start businesses. We saw immigration for the longest time as a matter of units of labor to be plugged into farms, and then later to be plugged into factories, rather than communities of people who would create economies of their own. And this was an explicit mission. Under Macdonald, under Laurier, under Borden, under Mackenzie King, throughout this diversity of governments, our immigration agents, during these great immigration campaigns where the vans were sent around Europe with sheafs of wheat painted on the sides and so on, our immigration agents were instructed that if people said that they were urban, or that they were entrepreneurial, or if they had an education, or if they had a trade, or if they had aspirations to create something, they were to be told, Canada's not for you. Please don't come here. Come to the United States. We wanted two categories of people: farmers and laborers who would work on farms. And that was quite explicit throughout that century. And we suffered a terrible loss. Now, it worked out well for us in certain respects because most of those people ignored that. Most of the people we brought over who'd been farm laborers in their past did not end up setting up farms. We had a wheat boom, it was successful, but it was never the largest share of the Canadian economy, because by that point, most of those farmers were settling in cities and forming urban communities and setting up industries. By 1904, Canada was an urban industrial economy. But it pretended not to be, really, right up until very close to 1967. And by pretending not to be, we suffered a loss in forms of development. Now we need to ask, after the Second War, we had a huge war of ideas over what sort of place Canada should be. We came out of the war recognizing this huge population deficit that we had. And we recognized that pretending to be linked in East-West trade to Britain had cost us sorely. It had cost us people. Most of those people who left because they could not afford to make a living here, because our economic East-West ties to Britain were not sustaining them enough, would not provide them enough of a livelihood. By closing the border with the United States, we had driven up the cost of the materials needed to start a business, to start a farm, to the point that it was uncompetitive with other countries, and it made more sense to leave. There were much better opportunities south of the border. And at the same time, we recognized that because we'd lost so much population, that we were being dominated by the United States, which by the end of the Second World War was the only significant economy in the Western world and in much of the world. And that recognition led to two ideas that were at war with each other in the 1940s and early 1950s, between the idea of trying to remain small and British and dependent, and attempting to be part of a North American economy with an expansionist population and one that recognized the pluralism of the country. And we never really settled that debate except de facto. We tripled our population between 1945 and 2015 without really thinking about it. We got lucky in most respects. We had the right houses in the right cities at the right price for the right people and the right jobs and the right business opportunities for the people who arrived, for the most part. We played a game of policy catch-up. After a decade of growth that we hadn't expected, our provinces would suddenly realize, oh, we don't have enough schools. Let's build a bunch, which is why most secondary schools in Canada looked like they were built within the same 5-year period in the 1960s, because they literally were. And in various other areas, we got lucky. And part of the argument of this book is that during the next 80 years of this century, we need to get skilled. We should recognize that population growth is going to happen. We want to have the policies here. But what are we left with that is a legacy of that century of deficit? It was a good century for Canada. It developed our standards of living to among the highest in the world. It made us an independent and peaceful and sustainable place after we faced up to many of our constitutional schisms and crises. But it left us with deficits in a couple of areas. The first was in what that century of non-inclusive growth did to the original peoples of Canada. In order to populate Canada during its first century, by way of filling land with people for strategic reasons, in order to populate the country in a way that saw us as a nation of farmers rather than a nation of communities, we, of course, shifted from a policy of seeing Indigenous nations of Canada as being partners, as recognized by the original constitutional documents, the treaties, to being problems to be solved, as being obstacles to being moved out of the way, as being people who had been the great masters of the global economy, as you could argue the Cree of the Plains were, to being people to be moved out of their territory into unfarmable lands in the Canadian Shield, deprived of food, and so on. Their children and grandchildren to be removed from their families and placed in residential schools, and so on. Their population to be reduced to 1/10 of the level it had been a century before. and we're left with the legacy of that. Again, 1967 was just the beginning of an awakening of those Indigenous nations of what they'd lost and where they stood in Confederation. They had only been given the vote 7 years before. But secondly, the second legacy of that period of non-inclusive growth was in the physical shape of the country, in our cities. We did not plan to develop as a country of cities and a country of metropolises and urban communities. They developed by accident. One of my favorite groups of paintings in Canadian history is Lawrence Harris's paintings, not his icebergs and that sort of thing, but his paintings of Toronto from earlier in his career, where he would do endless paintings of the shanty towns on the outside of Toronto, the unplanned communities, as geographers have called them, that's scattered across the landscape, looking a little like the slums of Mumbai or something. Self-built shacks, people would settle, dig a hole in the ground, put tin sheeting over it, live in it. Those represented, according to the geographer Richard Harris, who's actually a descendant of Lawrence Harris, by coincidence, those squatter informal settlements on the edge of Toronto, by the end of the First World War, they represented between a third and a half the population of Toronto. People had come in, these were the people who had been brought in to be farmers and to settle the plains, who had decided, no, I would actually like to live in a community and an economy that's together, but it wasn't designed for them. So they built their own squatter shacks on the edge of Toronto that made up a huge proportion of the population until those became an insalubrious crisis and were shut down by the government and normalized, or Hurricane Hazel destroyed some of them and that sort of thing. And that form of growth typified the way Canada's urban areas developed. They were accidental accumulations of housing. And as a result, we're left with a low population density across many of our urban areas, yes, including most of Toronto and most of Vancouver, that gives us a set of problems that we still face today. Low population density, low concentration of people is at the root of many of our difficult policy choices. We have trouble creating cohesive, sustainable communities because of our low population density, because we're spread out over large areas by not having planned it. We have difficulty, as anyone in Toronto knows, building rapid, efficient, energy-efficient public transit into the neighborhoods where people live. We have trouble building rapid, efficient mass transportation between cities. This leads to real barriers to ecological sustainability for Canadians. Because we've had a low density form of growth, we cannot find easy ways to afford the fiscal or the logistical necessities of making a shift to green and carbon neutral forms of mass transportation, of heating, of building design, and of energy generation in many parts of Canada at our current low population density levels. So we need to confront this fact that the legacy of our first century of growth is a form of geographies that hurt our ability to do the things ecologically, economically, and in terms of communities that we'd like to do. It particularly hurts us that now we have a form of inequality in Canadian cities that we're just beginning to acknowledge, which is that most newcomers to Canada are settling in these low-density places on the outskirts of our cities. Immigration in Canada is almost 100% suburban now, which is not necessarily a bad thing, except that people arrive at very low incomes. Our immigrants are an elite group, they're an educated group, but they still, within 15 years of arrival, are twice as likely to be earning incomes below $35,000 a year per family than the average Canadians. They're 1.5 times more likely than average Canadians to be in poverty after 15 years, despite having medical degrees and things like this. And settling in places with low population densities, with a lack of connection, a lack of markets, a lack of consumer bases for their small businesses, creates a risk of disconnection. It creates a risk of political disenchantment that we saw probably during the Toronto elections of a previous time. So we need to recognize that we have we have a set of factors caused by the patterns of population development in the past that makes it more difficult to handle population growth in the future. As well, we have a set of barriers to population growth that did not exist during the last 70 years that we need to confront because we have a housing supply shortage that makes it much more difficult and expensive to have housing. We have a labor market that's becoming increasingly fragmented and informalized, where people on the lower end of this spectrum depend on what development economists call portfolios of the poor. That is, mixture of contract work, buying and selling opportunities, small businesses, gig economy things, and so on, that may add up to a decent income at the end of the year, but we don't have the system of income support for those emerging forms of income to allow people to be able to raise families sustainably. We have not confronted those things. We've not confronted the crisis in skills recognition of newcomers to Canada that leaves entire generations wasted and so on. And those things are all things, and this is part of the message of Maximum Canada, that we need to confront even if we politically decide somehow to freeze the population at its current level. I doubt that any government, even one committed to doing that, would be able to do that. I think we need to assume that we're going to have a much higher population at the end of the century, even if we don't pursue the modest increases in immigration and in family policy that would bring it to 100 million at the end of the century. We need to have a policy mindset in Canada that we are going to triple our population by the end of the century. Because the things we need to do in order to set the stage for that tripling of the population, they are the things we need to do even if we don't do that. They're the things we need to do for our children and grandchildren because of the problems in the transition to ecological sustainability, in housing supply, in labor market and income policies, in family and child care policies, and so on. We're beginning to have some of the policy instruments of that. We have an infrastructure program that claims to be different from previous federal infrastructure programs in trying to address future population growth. We have the beginnings of a national housing strategy, and so on. We have things going on in a number of provinces that attempt to confront these things. And of course, our cities are the best equipped to look at future population growth. They're where it's going to happen. They have the best statistics and measuring of the places where it's going to occur. But we don't have communication between those levels of government. We recognize that we probably will have an increase in population comparable to that of the previous 70 years over the next 80 years, but we have not talked about a coordinated policy across departments and across levels of government to plan for that in the future so that we're not taken by surprise again in the future, so that it actually is inclusive growth in population. It's growth that includes all communities. It's growth that recognizes that Indigenous communities are at the forefront of population growth in Canada, that having sustainable populations for them is very, very important in order to have the educational and self-governance resources they need. There's a recognition that Quebec has wrestled with questions of population for far longer than English Canada and has recognized that absolute population is far more important than relative population and so on. So let me conclude by reading one paragraph from Maximum Canada that addresses what this future looks like. What does a sustainable population look like? It is enough people in the right concentrations to overcome the barriers of underpopulation in the long term. It is enough clusters of people across multiple generations with the right skills and capacities to support the public institutions and forms of expression and markets that befit a leading nation, to expand minority and Indigenous nations to be strong and self-sufficient, to shift further from resource extraction to a more sustainable value-added economy, to become more self-supporting should any of its major trading partners become unreliable. It means having a large enough base and density of population by the end of the 21st century to support the creation of institutions, economies, and ecological solutions that will support Canada through the more difficult demographic period when the world population starts shrinking. Solving underpopulation does not mean simply filling the country with people. A larger population by itself does not make a better, stronger, or more prosperous country. A sustainable population does not mean spreading people across the land, as we did in our first century. It means creating places where important things happen, where strong and tight-knit urban communities flourish, where towns participate in clusters of knowledge and innovation, and specialization takes shape, and where smart growth provides better stewardship and protection and even expansion of wild and agricultural lands. So what I'm saying here, looking back at 1967 and 1867 from 2017, is that we need to have more foresight than we did before. That we've hopefully overcome that period 50 years ago of needing to recognize that Canada is a country of multiple populations with multiple sovereignties and interests, and beginning to recognize that we can grow together and that we need to work together across communities, across populations, across geographies, across languages, across ethnicities, and across levels and functions of government to build for a future of population growth and population sustainability that genuinely is inclusive for all Canadians. Thank you very much. And I'd like to invite you to ask questions at these two microphones. I'm going to steward this myself. You can ask me anything except why your Globe and Mail didn't arrive on time this morning. And mine also did not, so there we go. And, yes, thank you.
Oh, we're just going to be passing the microphone.
Okay, yes. Okay, so the microphone will travel to you. This is sort of a luxury service here, so please take advantage of it. And I was giving a talk a couple years ago, and somebody in the audience asked a question about something about the policy, something about whether Britain should join the euro or something like that. And I gave the best answer I could in my fairly limited economic knowledge, and a hand shot up from the back of the room. And a guy stood up and said, "Excuse me, I think you have some important things about your explanation wrong." And I realized it was a former governor of the Bank of Canada. It was Gordon Thiessen. And I thought, God, the worst humiliation is to be upstaged by the guy whose signature is on the money. So this is the sort of room where that sort of intervention is perfectly capable of happening. So also feel free to correct me with your much greater expertise in these areas. Yes, I think we have a question here.
Yeah, I'm sort of doing this to get it going, because nobody else is. Population growth, immigration will come chiefly from immigration because we don't reproduce at a number that will achieve what you're saying should be optimal. We have a immigration policy that's based on skills, etc., skill levels. It's not a wide open thing. How do you propose that we attract the numbers that you think we need? And how does that impact those countries where they come from?
Mm-hmm. That's an excellent question. First of all, I should say, Canada will never need a policy of mass immigration or of open borders. We tried mass immigration quite successfully a century ago. And it worked at the time because we had a need of absolutely unlimited numbers of people in our minds to settle it. But if we were to have the level of immigration today that we had in 1913, we'd have 1.75 million immigrants per year coming into Canada now. Even the most dramatic proposals to raise the population to 100 million by the end of the century see it being raised slowly to something in the low 400,000s within 20 years. So from 0.8 to maybe 1.2 so 8 immigrants per 1,000 to 12 immigrants per 1,000 over a slow period. There's not going to be a need for uncontrolled or mass immigration in Canada. The other thing being that a large part of Canada's population issue involves family policy rather than immigration. We have what the scholars call a fertility gap, which basically means if you ask people couples in their 20s how many children they'd like to have, and then you ask couples in their late 40s how many children they ended up having, the gap between those two numbers is what they call the fertility gap. In Canada, the average couple says they would like to have, I think, 2.4 children, and we have on average 1.6 children per family. And a part of that gap is just people change their minds or they develop fertility problems and so on. But 7 out of 10 people surveyed say that the reason why they had fewer children than they expected is because they could not afford to. And that's largely because of childcare policy. And we know from the example of Quebec that you can use family policy to address population size. Quebec's subsidized childcare program, despite all the debates about its effectiveness and so on, it did cause the Quebec average family size to increase quite a bit, from way below the Canadian average to at first slightly above and now right at the Canadian average. And it paid for itself, because the extra income tax revenues it generated by women entering the workforce more than paid for the cost of the program. So first of all, I don't think we should be France and celebrate, popping out babies in the name of the nation and having the president give medals to the most fertile mothers and that sort of thing. But certainly family policy should be recognized as part of a population strategy, partly for political reasons, to understand that Canadians who feel shortchanged by the lack of resources to support their own families should not feel that they're in competition with immigrant families coming in. They should feel that it's a shared project, and so on. And there are a number of reasons to do it. For God's sake, we've been talking politically about national child care programs since Mulroney's election campaign in the early 80s and so on. It should be part of it. In terms of affecting sending countries, it's always a net benefit. I mean, one of the most important things Canada does is helps reduce the absolute poverty rate, but also reduce the fertility and the population growth rate of developing countries by linking to them by migratory networks. Countries with low income that are linked by immigration to countries of the developing world, and it's not countries that are linked, it's specific clusters of villages, urban neighborhoods, and so on. Places in countries that are linked to this way see much better outcomes in human development, in poverty rates, in agricultural modernization, and in family size and fertility. So for example, the Philippines has been the largest center of immigrants to Canada for the last 10 years or so. Those clusters of villages in Luzon, the big island that most Filipinos in Canada come from, those clusters and villages that are linked by immigration to countries like Canada see much better outcomes, much lower infant mortality rates, better longevity, et cetera, and smaller family sizes, often below population growth rates than those that are not linked by immigration to the West, and so on. So you could say that in Canada, in helping raise its population to a sustainable level, helps lower the inequities and deprivations of the sending countries, and also in a small but significant way helps deal with out of control population growth in some of the sending countries as well.
Is this working? Hi, Doug. It's John Stapleton. First of all, just a comment on the Philippines, and as you probably know, the only South Asian country that has a social security agreement with Canada is the Philippines, and so I guess it kind of makes sense. The first question is, why 100? Why not 50, 75, 125? And do you think there will be any sort of depopulation in the United States such that will be a longer term trend bringing Americans here? And or those 56 countries that we have social security agreements with because they have soil-based citizenship policies as opposed to blood-based citizenship policies. I'll leave it at that.
I'm not an evangelist of the 100 million target number. In fact, a core chapter in this book is called The Case Against 100 Million, which, to be fair, is a slightly facetious case against it. On the other hand, that number is partly my fault. And I do not think Canada needs to have an absolute number population target, in part because it's meaningless. Human populations, unlike other mammal populations, have no homeostatic balance. There's no way to produce a stable, non-changing human population. It's always either growing or shrinking. So if we have 1 week in 2098 when we pass 100 million, it won't mean anything. I did many years ago do an exercise for a piece of writing where I asked various well-known demographers, Morton Weinfeld was one of them, what they thought the ideal population of Canada would be. They all smartly said there's no such thing as an ideal population. But one thing they pointed out was that and I said, if we can occupy no more land than we currently do. In other words, what's the ideal population if we do not have any more sprawl, if we only increase the population in the envelope we have? Because certainly any population growth in Canada this century needs to be within existing land envelopes. There's no need for further growth. I mean, Toronto could easily triple in population without using any more land than it does right now, simply by turning single-family homes into multifamily units and that sort of thing. But I asked, what would be the ideal? And they pointed out that if that tiny little strip of land that Canadians live on along the south and a few little spots slightly north of the south were to have the population density of Northern Europe, of the Netherlands or Scandinavia, we would have 400 million people. And the Netherlands and Scandinavia are not exactly, Mad Max horror shows of I guess Blade Runner horror shows of overpopulation. Those are both movies about underpopulation, actually, come to think of it. Let's drop that analogy. Anyway, they're not Calcutta. And that 100 million seemed like a reasonable target, in part because that was the point when the United States crossed that population number in the 1920s, that it started to become a completely independent economic and cultural entity in many ways. So it's a slightly meaningless target, but it's been very popular over the years. Federal government committees in the mid-1960s, in the early 1970s, developed reports which said 100 million would be the ideal target population. Last year, the federal government's Advisory Committee on Economic Growth recommended a strategy to bring the population to 100 million by the end of the century, and there have been a number of think tanks and so on that have done it. But I would not get wedded to that big round number.
Thank you, Doug. First of all, I would like to thank you very much for your talk. Yeah, I found it very interesting. You presented a number of statistics and facts that personally I wasn't aware of, so it was very thought-provoking. Around the question of where the 100 million are going to go. Now, obviously the thinking is that we go to the major cities. Certainly Toronto and Vancouver receive a lot of them, and so I was thinking, how do you handle that, given, as you noted earlier, that they tend to be low density? And I'm thinking of Vancouver in particular, they've got Yaletown, but otherwise it is low density. They're surrounded by mountains, by ocean, by provincially protected farmland. So, as you said in your last comment, they really have to go up, not out. You need the increased density. But then the question is, how do you achieve that? Now, I know Ontario has got a little bit more control over planning in their municipalities, and in their recent housing strategy, they are bringing in some measures to encourage increased density. That is not the case in British Columbia. The government has at times lamented their lack of ability to affect planning and zoning decisions. And you look at the city of Vancouver, and the appetite there for increased density on city council doesn't seem apparent, and very understandably so, because, as I'm sure you're very well aware, people in low density zoned areas aren't really keen on having their areas rezoned into high density, and I don't see that changing. So how do you crack that nut? How do you build that higher density areas in areas where there are low density and where people aren't accepting of those sort of changes?
Well, first of all, let me step back one step and say, yes, large numbers, a large amount of Canada's future population growth will take place in its 5 biggest cities or 6 biggest cities or whatever you want. That's just the nature of how people settle in new countries. I mean, I often put out the 3 things immigrants always say that they're seeking when they choose what place in a country to live are, first of all, known small business or employment opportunities, which they usually learn about through their networks of communication. Second of all, clusters of people from similar linguistic or cultural backgrounds who can provide them networks of support, loan them money, help them find housing and that sort of thing. And third of all, housing that they can afford at their lower than average income levels. People will always, if they're going to abandon one of those 3 things, they will always abandon the third one. People will quite happily settle somewhere they can't afford to live if there are the networks of people and the economic opportunities for them. And they do. You don't see people settling in, there are a lot of places in Canada and in the world that have incredibly low cost housing that nobody in there, and we would not want to make people want to live somewhere just because there's low cost housing there. Whatever made the housing extremely low cost means that you shouldn't be settling there. That said, first of all, communities that are deprived can target people, can target families. We've seen lots of small towns that the big hotel or shop or whatever has lost the family that had run it, who target people from places known for being good at small business management, like Gujarat or the Punjab or southern China or so on, and targeting families to be brought in and run those things. It's sort of the root of the little mosque on the prairie phenomenon and so on. Second of all, a very major growth and possibly the largest growth area in Canada during this century for newcomer growth is going to be the second-tier cities with post-secondary institutions in them. If you ask educated immigrants where they're wanting to settle now, increasingly they're naming these places. Kelowna's and Kitchener-Waterloos and Hamilton Wentworths and Kitcheners and Trois-Rivières and Monktons and Lethbridges and so on that often are suffering post-industrial decline. They're cities that want people, that have housing, they want a tax base, they have the post-secondary institutions that newcomers to Canada need to upgrade their skills and credentials, and that there should be national and provincial strategies to turn these second-tier cities with post-secondary institutions into the hearts of clusters of knowledge and entrepreneurship and both data and physical transportation infrastructure to turn them into the next metropolises. Now that doesn't answer your question about the existing cities, which do suffer under population. I mean, Vancouver is a very small city. It has a land envelope, Greater Vancouver has a land envelope larger than the central boroughs of New York City, and it has a tiny fraction of the population spread across mostly a very low density area. I mean, the fact that a little central area on the peninsula has suddenly high population density detracts from the fact that most areas of metropolitan Vancouver have very, very low population density. But interestingly, metropolitan Vancouver has been on the leader of building density in those places. Surrey and Richmond, particularly Surrey, are both places that have learned to recognize that low population density is what's causing their social ills and their lack of attractiveness to newcomers, and have begun to solve those problems awkwardly, sometimes through lengthy debates, but certainly by turning single-family neighborhoods into more mixed-density neighborhoods and so on. I often, when I'm speaking to European cities about how to build tighter-knit newcomer communities, I point to some of Surrey's policies as examples of that. And that's getting noticed across the other suburban areas of lower mainland BC and Vancouver. Toronto suffers from even worse diseases of this stuff. Montreal does as well because it's such a hodgepodge of weird little municipalities. It's different from other cities in that it still has room on the island for newcomers to settle. It's not as suburbanized, but it has this hopscotch development going out into farmland because of the lack of coordinated governance. In Toronto, it is still far from confronting the fact that it's very ecologically and economically and humanely inefficient in its low density growth, but it's beginning to change. You're finally beginning to see dense developments along the Bloor Line subway corridors, which should have happened 30 or 40 years ago, starting to develop. You're starting to see an acceptance of high-rise life as being the normal life rather than being something for disdained condo dwellers and that sort of thing. So you're starting to see the cultural change. And I think what will produce the change to allow, where people in single family, where look, right now if I have a single family house detached and I want to turn it into a unit with 7 apartments in it of fairly nice quality, first of all, my neighbors will have the ability to stop me. And second of all, they will stop me because they see those apartment dwellers as being strangers coming into the neighborhood. Now, I think we do need a new type of planning regime where the people who are able to stop or allow a new development like that are not just the current residents of a neighborhood, but are the future and potential residents of a neighborhood. They need to have a greater say. But I think that will de facto happen because what my neighbors increasingly are seeing as being the use of that type of denser housing in a single family is not weird strangers from some other place who are going to move in. They see that as being their children. They see that as being themselves. I think if I talked about digging out the basement of my house a little deeper to potentially turn it into a separate apartment, mainly because of my terror that my kids won't be able to afford anywhere to live, both when they're in university and after. And I said that to one of my, to my son. I said, why don't we try to redo the basement so that, you know, when I'm older, maybe maybe you'll want to live there someday. And he said, Dad, you're going to be old. You're going to live in the basement. I'm going to be upstairs. And I think you multiply that sort of family phenomenon by millions of people, you start to see the change that will change neighborhoods from being exclusive to being more welcoming. When we start seeing it as not being them, but as being us. Two more quick questions. Yes.
Hi. I was wondering, so you mentioned the need to plan for more infrastructure and things like that, and you actually also mentioned housing in the previous response. I was wondering if you could give us some more insight on other social policies or other social supports that we would need to plan for as the population grows, either in the cities or at the provincial level or federally.
Yeah, it's not all just a matter of housing. It's housing, it's transportation. I worry about the isolation of a lot of neighborhoods. David Holchansky's famous and much discussed map of Toronto, which shows that in 1970, all of the poverty in Toronto was in the dense center, and then by 2012, and all of the wealth and immigration and all the wealth and educated people were around the outskirts. By 2012, it had completely inversed itself, where the dense downtown core was entirely high income, 80% white, university educated, and the suburbs are low income, minority, highly prone to poverty, lower education, and so on. I mean, that produced the election of Rob Ford, among other things. One of the things I warn about is the possibility of angry, rejectionist, populist politics in Canada coming not from angry white voters like in the United States, but coming from angry, excluded feeling minority voters who were Rob Ford's constituency and that sort of thing. So the price of physical and transportation isolation can be not just economic, but can be political as well and so on. But as I said, income supports for increasingly diversified portfolios of income and longer periods of precarious employment for people to allow that. A much better both skills recognition and skills transition regime, allowing people to transition into skills much better. A much better regime of small business development. I think there's an important set of policies around the world that we need to confront, which I call filling in the empty spaces. And that a lot of people are now living in communities with forbidding, scary, empty spaces between the buildings and so on, that are not just bad for settlement and what sometimes gets called integration and inclusion, but economic development. There's no place in the places where people now live to do the classic Canadian immigrant thing, which is to start a small business or a shop or a restaurant or a small factory or service industry in the space where you live, maybe even in the same building where you live, that form of small business development was the engine of social mobility for Canadian newcomers for most of the last century. That combination of small business within the area of dwelling and of home ownership was very, very important to Canada being a much more inclusive place with high rates of social mobility for newcomers. And for both policy reasons and geographic reasons, that form of settlement and home ownership and small business is inaccessible to people now. I welcome things like the Toronto zoning policy that's called tower renewal, which allows the characteristic form of Toronto housing is the slab farm apartment district in the suburbs. That's our most sort of characteristic form. We have 2,000 of those buildings. Finally, we have a thing that allows the basically old ladies who own those buildings to fill the empty spaces between them with places for business and restaurants and so on. And ideally low-rise housing as well, to fill in the empty spaces and to create, not just for the reasons I mentioned of creating greater density, allowing for tighter-knit communities, but also in allowing small business to flourish and that sort of thing. So these are some of the policy areas that need to be addressed, but also I would point strongly to education policy. Canada has been very strong at structures of primary and secondary education that create fairly rapid inclusion, that allow people to obtain language skills without excluding from the community, and that I think most importantly don't contain strong incentives for particularly the male children of immigrants to leave school at 16 or whatever the minimum age is, which is one of the biggest problems in Europe right now, is school systems that contain very strong incentives to leave for people who aren't part of the dominant community. But there are signs of stress on this in many parts of Canada. There are signs of sort of the downward spiral in educational quality in many lower income and newcomer communities. And it's worth looking at policies to start putting very high quality target schools in the most deprived communities, aside from the very large question of educational institutions in Indigenous communities and so on. We need sort of, I mean, I hate to say it, but this should be another area where the feds take on provincial competency and start talking about national strategies of inclusive education. Maybe keeping their hands out of the pedagogical and employment aspects of education, but looking at the retention and inclusion aspects of education as a coordinated national strategy. Anyway, I could go on. Mm-hmm.
Hi, I just have a question in terms of immigration policy. So the population projections I've seen they're showing a growing gap between fertility and mortality going forward. And I think in order to maximize Canada, you're going to have to maximize immigration. You're talking about how the geographic target for immigration have gone from the UK to Western Europe to Eastern Europe and to opening up the doors everywhere. I think perhaps a motive is because of necessity, right? Going forward, you can see over the next 2 or 3 generations, you can see how Eastern Europe is becoming more prosperous now. You can see how China is becoming more prosperous now. There's economic convergence that's currently happening across the world. Do you think the pool for attracting immigration to Canada is going to become increasingly challenging, especially the quality immigrants, like quality economic immigrants that we would want? Do you think that it'll be harder to attract the number of immigrants that you suggest that we need?
Yes, that's an excellent question to close on, so thank you. The question is, this is what I've called peak people, which is a little bit like the popular peak oil theory of 10 or 15 years ago that I think hasn't stood up very well to the test. But it's the same principle that when the supply of something reaches its peak and starts to level out and fall, that you start having crises. And we're sort of at that point with immigration populations around the world right now. There aren't a lot of countries that send immigrants to Western countries. It's not true that very poor countries and overpopulated countries suddenly rupture and start sending people to the West. In fact, countries with overpopulation and high poverty are among the least likely ever to send immigrants beyond their neighboring countries. I mean, Niger probably is both the poorest and most, the fastest population growth rate in the world, and it sends almost nobody to Western countries. It's usually when countries reach a certain level of prosperity that they start sending international immigrants. That, unfortunately, is when their supply of people starts drying up. I mean, countries that no longer have growth level family sizes, countries that have family sizes below 2 children per family now include Iran, which had 8 children per family 20 years ago, now 1.7, Turkey, Lebanon, Tunisia, even countries like Bangladesh are falling toward Western levels. That doesn't mean Canada will stop being a popular destination for those educated and successful people wanting to move, but it means there's going to be a lot more competition among countries to attract those families who are willing to move. China's taking immigrants now, you know. A lot of these countries are looking to compete with us for attracting people rather than to be countries that send people. They'll keep sending people, or people will keep leaving them because they're attractive reasons to leave here. But we shouldn't pretend that Canada's naturally attractive. I do have a whole section in Maximum Canada called No, It's Not the Weather, showing that it wasn't the weather that caused us not to grow during that period, and I can prove that. But we do need to recognize the fact that it's going to be much more competitive. Rather than competing to limit immigration, we're soon going to reach a period where developed Western countries with growing economies and therefore a need for newcomers are going to be competing with each other to offer more generous family reunification packages, better settlement services. Our banks are already ahead of this curve. Canada is unique among Western countries in that our big banks are sort of leading agents of immigration. They are out there in Pakistan and China and the Philippines trying to sign up families for mortgages and bank accounts before they immigrated, in some cases before they even think of immigrating, so that those families will be tied to their financial services for many generations in the future and so on. There's a recognition that those who offer the best of this stuff are the countries that are going to get it. So that's part of the reason why we're talking about this now in 2017 and not in 2085 or something like that. It's because if we want to talk about having a sustainable population, a sustainable level of population density, we want to start confronting this now before it becomes much more difficult to do, so that we can get into the game early and start solving our problems before they become much more expensive and difficult to do. So thank you, everyone. Yeah.
Hi, Sunil Johal. I'm the backup MC here for today's event. I wanted to thank Doug for his remarks. We got him a gift. It's not a copy of Maximum Canada, but it is a copy of a book by a certain TVO, The Agenda host. So hopefully you haven't read that one yet, but you gave us a lot to think about, and I think it's one of these big, bold ideas that can get us thinking about what the possibilities for Canada are. So please join me again in thanking Doug for his participation. Thanks, Doug.